welcome to the Logosphere. This is Chris Stites, here as always with JD Roof.
Hello, good evening.
And tonight we're going to try something a bit different. JD is going to interview me, so I don't know whether you would consider him to be in the hot seat or I. But we wanted to talk about a recent experience that I went through, which is grief, tragedy, and I'm a couple years out from the experience, and I thought it would be interesting to have you, explore.
I'm going to be the bull with you. So, yeah, I mean, this is a topic, I think, when we study existentialism and death and tragedy and chaos, this is something that I think we actually enjoy studying, but when it comes to your front door, it's not enjoyable, and it really hurts. So maybe we'll start, I'll ask you, what's what happened to you, because this is going to be based around your father's death that was recent in the last 2 years, and it was cancer related.
Correct.
Right. And maybe you can give a little, I'll ask you a couple series of questions. So when did you find out about your dad's diagnosis? What was the prognosis, like how much time did they give him, and what was your initial reaction to it?
So I might have to back up a little bit, which is...
Or we could go origin, too. You could go, where you grew up, what was your relationship like with your father?
I think it's worth first saying that I lost my mother to cancer.
Okay.
In 2011.
So still pretty close, yeah.
She was 58 when she died.
Wow.
And I found out about her diagnosis while I was in the East Coast at school. And she was dead 5 weeks later.
Wow.
And I was there at her bedside. I left school, I took a leave, and I flew home. And I was there for the last week of her life. And my father and I were at either side of her bed as she expired. And then I hung out for a week or so, and then I went back to school. And but my father then, 10 years later, had his own ticket was punched.
Wow.
And the way that looked, it's kind of, as it relates to me, it's a bit of a bigger picture situation, which is, it was in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So I was working, I'd been working for years. And then just prior, it was at the end of 2019. I get these few years all mixed up, but it was the day after Christmas. The company that I worked for went under, and it was sort of, the writing was on the wall for a little while, so it didn't come as a big shock. But
what company was it?
I won't name it by name, but it was a drug and alcohol treatment program.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Located in Santa Monica, California.
Okay.
Great program, but it's a wild industry, and they came under hard times and tried to stay afloat and did everything they could, and after long enough, they had to eventually turn in their key. But I went unemployed, and, when you look at major disruptive life events, losing a job would probably be on the short list of things that can sort of disorient someone.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened, and then it was 2-3 months later that the COVID-19 incident that was kind of looming suddenly took on new proportions, and the president got on television and said, we're shutting down air travel, and and then the lockdown started, and so then that was all transpiring. My father was starting to get sick in the midst of all that.
Yeah. Were you unemployed before you knew the diagnoses? Or?
Yes.
Okay, so you're unemployed. You're sober how many years from drugs and alcohol? 8 years at the time.
Yeah.
You have a pretty strong program, and when I mean that, you're helping a lot of people, and you're getting through to a lot of people, right?
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Elaborate.
Well, so that touches on the fact that I have my own history of substance abuse and my own history of recovery from substance abuse, and that's a whole long story in and of itself. But within that 8 years, I really embraced a new life of sobriety, which took a lot of action, which took a lot of spiritual development, and it became a central part in my life. But I fell victim to, the pitfall of, no longer needing to do the things I needed to do when I needed to do them more.
So like resting on your laurels?
Resting on your laurels.
Okay.
That I'd come a long way, so I distanced myself from, things that were central to, what got me somewhere that I really wasn't possible for someone like me.
Right.
Little by little,
Inch by inch.
Yeah.
Second by second. Yeah. Minute by minute. Yeah.
Which may have been fine, I might still have that same sobriety date today, but I wasn't prepared, I suppose, for some major tidal waves that were way off in the distance. And so right around the time that my company went under, my father started to get sick. And so his diagnosis wasn't obvious right away. It was just, and the thing is, I was living with my father. At this point, I was in my, I'm 34 years old, 33 years old. And I had flown the coop for many years. And now I had just spent the last 5 years or so, just me and my dad, like a bachelor pad, living in downtown Los Angeles. This sweet-ass artist loft on the 12th floor on Spring Street. Big open floor plan, exposed brick, decked out. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, it's funny, just to interject a little, because I knew you then. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we were in conversation and you were telling me about how you're thinking about moving down to downtown LA. Mm-hmm. And I remember I think I kind of batted an eye at that internally because you were so plugged in the community we were out in Ventura County. But, to each their own, right? Like if you want to go make a change and you feel connected and it's with your dad, I mean, that's great, right? Mm-hmm. And you probably had some great years, right?
I did.
Yeah.
I don't regret any of it. Right. Whether it was a mistake or not, I don't know. And I'm back here and I'm glad that I am.
Right.
But that happened. It was good, though, because I think like a lot of young men, we have sometimes adversarial relationships with our fathers.
Right.
We have to contend with our fathers.
Or they cast a shadow that we are trying to either get out of or get perfectly fit into.
Yeah, exactly. Or to overshadow. And since I obviously had my own difficulties, like a lot of young people do, and maybe more pronounced for me than the average person, my dad and I went through a lot of years where we weren't super cool,
Right.
And it was really a blessing that suddenly we had this new opportunity where I could come back and I could really have some quality time to spend with my father. So I would see him every day. Mm-hmm. I'd go off, I'd go to work, I'd do this, I'd do that, I'd come home and Dad was there. He was doing his thing. And then it was just, he just started to sleep a lot more, So all of a sudden it was like, what's going on? It's been a few days, and it's this, my dad was always a famous sleeper, but now this doesn't seem quite right,
Right.
And I'm not sure what's going on, and then he starts getting confused, and it just doesn't seem like it's quite right.
Did you think it was something else, like dementia or something like that, or early onslaught dementia, or however they frame it? Yeah.
Yeah, I did think that it could be that. His brother had just before that recently died from a disease called multiple system atrophy.
Whoa.
And multiple system atrophy is sort of like a Parkinsonian type disease that's pretty rare. But essentially what happened to him is he, just started to get a little stiff. And then within just a handful of years, he was completely paralyzed and could barely speak and was confined to a bed for a few years until he finally died.
Were you close to your uncle?
No.
No. Okay. Where was he residing?
He was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where my dad grew up.
Okay.
He was the one of the 4 kids that stayed home. He continued to own the family house, which was a 3-story, 4,000 square foot, big old home in downtown Kalamazoo. And he had kept it and he used it as a recording studio. He became a pretty renowned recording engineer that worked mostly with like very authentic jazz. He was a jazz aficionado. So they'd have a big open living room and the band would come right in there and they would record everything very naturally. And he was really a kind of stickler for his methods. But anyway, near the end of his life, my father being the last two of the four siblings, he would make periodic visits back to Michigan to visit his brother, and I would go along with him. So Uncle John I knew throughout my life, but we were never very close. He looked a lot like my father, but temperamentally he was very different. My dad was very extroverted and gregarious and a big storyteller, and people really loved him. And some people said that Uncle John was a little bit more like me, or maybe I like Uncle John, that he was more introspective and more introverted. He also, though, had, and maybe like me to myself during different times in my life, had a propensity to be depressed. But as he got very ill, my dad wanted to be there for him. He had no children. He wasn't married. He had a longtime girlfriend. But I would go back with my dad for these trips, and it was great because it was very hard on my father in a way that it wasn't hard on me, because I didn't have the same relationship with him.
Yeah, it's not your brother.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And so I would go with my dad, and you could tell every time my dad would have to, it really took a toll on him to go out there and to see his brother like this. And I considered the opportunity to be able to go out with him sort of a privilege, because I could tell that it meant a lot to my dad to have someone there who could remain somewhat neutral and sort of sober, not just, not in the sense that we meant before, but lucid and centered.
Grounded.
In a circumstance that he was incapable of doing. But he eventually passed away. But when my father started getting sick, there was that, maybe it's related. He had been diagnosed with, sort of, not diagnosed with, but he was always suspicious he had another condition called pure autonomic failure. He had a strong tremor in his hand. And we just had this feeling like maybe in the Stites family, there's like this kind of, these neurological disorders are a bit misunderstood, and maybe there's something going on. All the siblings are kicking the bucket a little earlier than the average Joe. And from some of these kind of, these ways that aren't, it's not just cancer, it's these other disorders that are a little bit harder to put your finger on.
Right.
And so that was one of the first thoughts. And
when did you get the diagnosis for cancer, though, for your father?
I don't remember the exact how far it was. So I would say just right at the beginning of 2020, that was his first trip to the hospital.
Okay.
And then he died on September 18th of 2020. So he died about 9 months after his first trip to the hospital, but the cancer thing didn't come in until probably halfway through that. He just kept winding up in the hospital.
And nobody knew what was really wrong with him?
No one really knew what was wrong with him. One symptom he had that is really giving me an interesting perspective is he started to have real severe urinary issues, where he couldn't pee. His bladder was kind of shot, and that's, it's just, you take things like that for granted.
Right.
The privilege really of being able to urinate.
Yeah.
Just
something simple that you take for, yeah. Wow.
And so we're going there, and before I think he even got the cancer diagnosis, they ended up just putting he ended up having a Foley catheter implanted, and he just wore it all the time.
So was it did he die from multiple things, or was it directly from the cancer?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
Because eventually what happened is they thought he had some cirrhosis on his liver, which he did. It turned out to be a lesion, which ended up being cancerous. And when you find, I guess the liver is not often a primary organ for cancer, and I could be wrong about this, but it's generally when people have cancer in their liver, it's because it's metastasized from a different location.
Oh, okay.
So his cancer was like that. They found it in the liver, but they can tell by doing a biopsy that it's not liver cancer.
Right. And
they can tell what type of origin it has. And his was something called, what was it called? Neuroendocrine. He had a neuroendocrine tumor. And endocrine relates to your endocrine system,
Right.
which is sort of the system that controls your hormonal functions.
Right.
And initially they thought it probably originated in his pancreas. Now, Steve Jobs, to the best of my understanding, had neuroendocrine pancreatic cancer.
Right.
So he didn't have traditional pancreatic cancer. He had this other type of pancreatic cancer.
How rare is that? Is it like a weird?
It's more rare, and it's less deadly. So pancreatic cancer is really bad, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
But Steve Jobs lived for quite a while, and I think there's some skepticism or some feeling that he could have maybe lived longer if he had managed his health care differently.
Okay.
I think he went off and wanted to try other methods, that were maybe not so tried and true.
Now, was your dad working, or was he retired?
He was retired.
No, what was his field?
He worked in the music industry his whole life.
Okay.
He was a professional drummer for 20 years, and then he became a tour manager and also an audio engineer, like his brother. But instead of doing studio recording so much, he did more live performance.
So that's something that runs in the family.
It does.
Art, music, recording, all that. Anything that's involved with art, really, like performance.
Very much.
That's something. And your mom, too, was...
My mother was a pianist. She was a music major.
Yeah.
And she was also a painter, but a very amateur painter. And it was something that she really adopted later in life. Near the end of her life, she started to go back to taking art classes, private art classes, and I still have paintings of hers up in my house. But she was talented. So yeah, the apple didn't fall far from the tree in that regard.
Right.
But my father worked very close to the point of his illness. I think he had done a show. He was the production manager for a concert venue in downtown Los Angeles that is called Grand Performances, which I think was at a time the largest provider of free outdoor concerts in the country. And he was there for over 20 years, putting on shows, and he eventually retired, but he became production manager emeritus, so he was still involved. And he did his last show not too long before he got sick. So he had a very slow, gradual retirement.
Do you think that retired him, though, the sickness? Like, it just kind of naturally did, because he was more and more debilitated?
Yeah.
More tired?
Yeah, even his last show, it was obvious that, you had to give Fred a little bit more time, and he was there because people loved to have him around, but he couldn't walk very far. That started to happen for him. He would get out of breath very easily. He'd have to sit down a lot. He became partially ambulatory at best.
Was he in a wheelchair?
No.
No.
Not until closer to that time of his death.
Wow. So you were living with him, and you're watching this man that's like your dad, right? Gradually, slowly, kind of. It's like the ape picture, but backwards. You know, like evolving from an ape to a man standing upright. He's going back down.
Exactly. And very much to eventually a childlike state.
Like a fetal position.
Of someone who was in diapers, who was non-communicative, who was completely reliant on me and my sister to do everything for him.
Well, how do you deal with something like that? I mean, I think that's the $1 million question, right? Like, how are you sitting here right now, right, from that? Yeah. Because I've never experienced something like that. I mean, there's other people in the world that have, obviously, but man, that's like that's super, super heavy stuff, right? Yeah. And you're kind of already it sounds like in what you said that your relationship with him is starting to get better because you moved in with him, not because of the cancer, not because of any kind of sickness. It was just like, hey, maybe this is like a living amends type of thing, and we're going to kind of bro out a little bit, have the father-son relationship maybe we never had or were lacking, and then suddenly this curveball just gets thrown into the, you know what I mean? It's like a fireball. It's not even a curveball. And
how it's survivable is one question, but then also why it's so devastating is another question. That comes to mind.
Maybe that's what I'm getting at. Yeah,
because I wasn't the sick one. I just had to, feed him and do this and do that. It was a different, it's obviously a different toll that it takes.
Yeah. Would you get upset?
I would.
Yeah, because I mean, you're having I just know this being a father, like changing a diaper of a kid. Eventually, after 20 diapers, or 10 diapers, 5 diapers, you're like, fuck this, right?
There was part of me that, some of the more shameful experiences of caring for him is that really in retrospect, there was part of me that really resented him for getting sick.
So you were mad at him?
I was mad at him. Yeah. And I think that part of me wished he was faking, that there was that he was just being a big baby. And why wouldn't he just toughen up, drink some water, go for a walk down the hall, stop letting yourself go, don't give up. And yeah, it's hard enough to change a baby's diaper, but try to change a 175-pound man's diaper who can't move.
Wow. Yeah.
And then it's your dad. And suddenly, there's the first time you have to do that,
Right.
For a while you don't, and then you do.
And it's just like,
and you don't
just have to be done.
Yeah. You realize it has to be done, not gracefully,
Right.
through a lot of mistakes and messes.
Right.
But there was a lot of, there was what I found is that there was kind of a bell curve of sorts of difficulty in caring, that as he started to get sick and he became less capable of caring for himself, and the learning curve of what I needed to do to step in to help,
right,
it was very demanding. But at some point he became so sick that, near the end it was easy, at least physically,
right,
because he wasn't fighting anymore. He wasn't trying to get up. He was, he was so slowed down that the caring demands were not very high. But that transition, that first time that you realize you can't make it to the bathroom or even to the commode,
right,
and just the pain through the night. It's just, I would try to sleep, with my door open near him, and just constant calling
to you.
Yeah, we had all these different, we had a doorbell we set up by his, I'd have the bell in my room, and it was electronic and remote, and he would press the doorbell. Speaking of doorbell. That was weird.
Well, you just said we, too. Is there somebody else?
Well, my girlfriend is living with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when did she move in?
That was a new relationship.
Welcome to the family.
Yeah, we started to date officially on March 12th, and so he started getting sick at the end of the previous year, and so by the time we started dating, he was obviously sick, but still didn't have cancer. And we started to date in the middle of the pandemic. We tied the knot, so to speak, when she was in England, visiting family. And it was at that same time that the news broke to the world. And so she made her way back here, and she did the obligatory, quarantine time. And then we essentially just moved in with each other, right away, which is not something that would have been customary for either of us.
Right. But it kind of sped things up, the pandemic. And
we started to go back and forth between my place and her place, but really quickly it became evident that my dad couldn't go any given period of time without someone there.
So how do you think your dad took it? What kind of man was he?
It's interesting.
Did he joke about it?
He did joke.
Okay.
One joke that was a running one was that he inherited $1 million from his brother. But the way the money worked is that he would be allocated $25,000 every quarter.
Well, okay, every year. Yeah.
And once he died, the money stopped, and the rest of the money went to a scholarship fund for jazz musicians that my brother set up.
Wow.
So he would have to live for 10 years in order to collect all the money. And he only made it about one,
Oh, wow.
And so as it became evident that my dad's time was coming up, the running joke was that if he died, he just wanted us to move him into the corner room and put him on ice and just tell everyone that Fred was sleeping so we could keep cashing the checks.
So there's some humor.
There was some humor to it.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
So it sounds like your dad was kind of a funny guy. Like he had jokes and he had humor and he was an artist, Yeah.
Some interesting points. There's So eventually, we'll jump around a little bit, but eventually we went on hospice. He went on hospice.
Right.
And that was a whole difficult decision to make, because I'm sure it is for anyone. Because essentially when you decide to go on hospice, you're foregoing any life-saving treatment. So there were certain treatments for that type of cancer that he was prescribed that he had to forego in order to accept hospice care. And we eventually made that decision.
What was that like?
It was tough. It was something my sister and I struggled with. But ultimately we felt like we wanted it to be my father's decision, obviously. Right. It's hard to say to your dad, hey, Dad, I think it's time to give up. But that's where we got, in essence, but it was just our feeling is that based on where you're at, the treatment that you'd be letting go of is probably not doing you any favors. Based on the advice of your oncologist, the different doctors, and the level of care that you would be entitled to would be worth it, Then they start to send over home health care. They give, end of life pain management. Right. They send someone over to wash you and do this and do that. And so he was going to the City of Hope, and he had a monthly visit where he would get his octreotide injection, which was it's essentially the neuroendocrine tumor. One of the symptoms of it is it produces an extreme excess of serotonin production. And his joke was always like, a lot of serotonin, this should be great, But it's not that simple, You think serotonin is something you want, but you don't want that much serotonin. And it does a lot besides put a smile on your face. It controls all kinds of systems in your body. So the octreotide injection would essentially suppress the serotonin production.
So what happens if he gets too much serotonin? Like, do you get overstimulated? Or
I can't remember no, it wasn't like that. It was more, it had to do with how his organs functioned and just real systemic, bodily systems were negatively affected.
Yeah, start shutting down or not working properly. Wow.
So most of the octreotide injection would really slow down the damaging effects of the cancer. Okay. But every time he would try to go out to receive his injection, the travel was so strenuous that he would be unable to receive it, because by the time he got there, he would be in a critical kind of state. Wow. And so he'd end up in their emergency room, and it was COVID, and he'd spend a few days there, and they'd stabilize him, and they'd send him home, and then he'd try to go back out again, and the same thing would happen. And so finally we said, hey, Dad, this is what it looks like, and this is what we think you should do. What do you want to do? And he said, I want to try to make it out there one more time. And so my sister came over early, and we rallied the troops, and we did everything in our power to try to get him over to City of Hope.
So you got to get him in the car. Yeah. He was wheelchair bound now.
Yeah, we had to get him out of the bed, into the wheelchair, wheel him to the car, get him in the front seat, and drive half an hour to the hospital. Mm-hmm. Simple enough, right?
Right.
Wrong.
That's crazy.
And about 10 minutes from the hospital, he thought he was actually dying. And by the time we got there, he was saying, this is it, he thought he was actively dying. And they sent over, like a lift to extract him from the car, an entire like emergency response team that had the defibrillators and oxygen, and it was a whole thing. And they couldn't get him out of the car. This whole team of healthcare professionals could not get him out of the car, and he is so distressed. He's panicked. He thinks he's dying. And I get out, and it's like a fight or flight thing. And I just go in, and I physically, with all these people with all their medical equipment, I just grab my father, and I just pick him out of the seat, and I place him on the gurney. And they have to stabilize him again, and he doesn't get the injection, and he comes home, and it's obvious that it's hospice time. And he probably died a week later.
Man, so... But he made the decision.
Yeah.
After that experience, he was like,
Yeah.
I'm throwing in the towel.
But the interesting thing about hospice is one of the services they provide is like spiritual guidance. And so my father, I grew up and my mother was Catholic. And so my sister and I were baptized Catholic. And as a family, we went to Catholic Mass every Sunday and were involved in the church. And then drifted away a bit. And to me, it always seemed that my father was not,
on board.
Especially on board. But there's a long history. My father was a music major, but at school he minored in moral Catholic theology. And there was a professor there who was a Catholic priest. I think he was a Jesuit, maybe. Mm-hmm. And his specialties were euthanasia, and homosexuality in the priesthood. So these were the areas that he had studied a lot as an active, ordained Catholic priest. And he was very influential on my father. He really looked up to him. And so when that being said, I didn't see a lot of that growing up. And when they asked me, would he like any spiritual, counsel? Mm-hmm. And I felt pretty confident, and I said, no, I don't think so. And him, on his deathbed, sort of rolls over and says, yes, I would.
Wow.
Yeah, yes, I would. And so they sent someone.
What did they send for that? Like a priest, or?
I don't know what it was. Wasn't a priest. It was someone more secular, who
right.
had some sort of training. He was a young kid, and to me, he struck me as a kid who was in over his depths.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a concept to put somebody in that kind of position.
Yeah.
I mean, you gotta cut an orange your first time.
Exactly.
But still, like.
Yeah.
You get the new guy.
Yeah. I know.
That's gnarly.
And but my father had him, and I purposefully eavesdropped on their session. So I was behind the headboard of the bed, and I was listening to their conversation. And I know that my father, he asked my father if he was afraid. And he said no. And I've often thought about that question. I think about this a lot. Here's what I think about. I think about going to work one day or something and surveying everyone and asking them the simple question, are you afraid to die? Mm-hmm. And my suspicion is that more people would say no than really are. And I have a suspicion that the fear of dying and being dead, if that's even a fear to rationally have, is probably one of the most substantial, universal facts of our lives. But I think that people are probably incentivized or motivated to say they're less afraid of dying than they are. I could be totally wrong, but I think about this sometimes.
So what you think people are more afraid of it than what they let out, right?
Yes.
It's like a repressive.
It's telling. I'm not. No, it's I'm at peace with it.
I'm good. Yeah, it'll be all right.
No regrets.
I did my stuff. Yeah. But that's not true.
I don't think so. But who's to say? But I can say that my father was probably not lying then.
Right.
He didn't.
And there's that thing, with the people that are right at the end of they're about to close their eye. They're about to go take the nap, right?
Yeah.
The long nap. And they get this kind of almost spiritual strength, and everything kind of makes sense. They're ready to go. They have no fear.
I have a quick story about that, which is my grandmother, my mom's mom, she died of cancer in her early 70s. And so it always seemed she was a bit disapproving of my dad. This is an old story, right? Mm-hmm. The parents who feel like their child's spouse is really not worthy, mm-hmm. and probably more stereotypical for, son-in-laws especially. Mm-hmm. So my dad was a musician. He slept until noon. He took long baths. Yeah. He was like, and they were very just World War II era, straight-laced, Catholic.
Conservative, probably more. Yeah.
And there was always that feeling, and my mother had a very serious courtship with another Fred before my dad, who was a very successful doctor, who came to my mother's funeral and had at that point a wife that was, a third his age, and died a very rich man.
Right.
And so we think that Gaga maybe always felt like Kathy should have, done. She wanted her daughter to be secure, and to be prosperous.
Right.
And she had this opportunity right at her fingertips, and she let it go for the
artist.
The artist.
Yeah. Yeah.
But right at my grandmother's deathbed, she looking in my dad's eyes, said to him, "Fred, you've been a real prince."
Wow.
Yeah. So that same person who has spent years being disapproving,
right?
Her last feelings about him were really gracious.
Yeah. Huh. That's a fascinating story. Just the fact that you almost become at peace before you go truly to peace.
It's comforting.
Right.
It's comforting.
Yeah, exactly. Like, maybe she had a resentment, maybe not. Who knows, right? But she's always going, this guy's maybe not good enough for my daughter, right?
Yeah.
And then at death's bed, she goes, why do I even care about that? You're a prince.
She saw the best qualities of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So let's go back to your dad. Your dad says he's not afraid.
Yeah.
How much more of the conversation went on?
There wasn't that much depth to it, but so there was my sister, and his name's going to escape me now, but my sister, through a mutual acquaintance, came into contact with this man who was a trained Buddhist.
Okay.
And had spent many years working in hospice. And this guy he had earned his stripes in the dead and dying, dimension.
Right.
And he just of his own time, not because hospice paid him or anything like that. We didn't even know him, it's just like someone put us in touch, and he came over in the last week of my dad's life.
Wow.
And
did you get to hear that conversation?
They didn't even have a conversation because he was so far gone. But we talked to him with my dad dying, 5 feet away. Wow. And one of the things that he didn't suggest, but he just let us know, is that what happens usually in the West, for lack of a better term, is that when people die, you call the company and they send over a truck and they get rid of the body right away.
Right.
And he said legally, you don't have to do that. And then also, practically, you don't have to do that. A body doesn't become dangerous hours or even days after it dies. Mm-hmm. And he said in other cultures, it's customary to leave the body and to have people come visit and to spend time with the body. And so my sister and I opted to do that. And it was a bit challenging. When he died, we had to call hospice and say, he has died. Please don't come.
Wow.
And they said, we'll give you a few hours, but we need to at least get we need to sign the death certificate. So they sent someone over to prove that he was dead. And then they left again. And
without the body.
Without the body.
Yeah.
And we just kept it overnight.
One night?
One night.
What did you guys do?
Claire and I spent the night out there. We just put on some candles and we just sat there, and we meditated. Yeah.
With him?
With him. I had some strange visions that I can't really recall now that night. And then the next day, he was obviously starting to die. I mean, he was dead, but he was more obviously dead.
Yeah, like rigor mortem and all that. Like, it starts hardening up.
He started to look different.
And coloring goes away.
Yeah. And he came back over. The Buddhist hospice person came back over, and he helped us. We undressed him, and we cleaned him, and we prepared him.
What was that like?
It was nice.
It was nice.
We brought over a couple friends.
Were you in tears when you did all that?
No.
No?
Not at all.
Was it, like, what was the feeling, though? Like, was there closure in that? Is that maybe why there's a difference between the West? Because it seems like The West likes to just like put it in a box and get rid of it, right? Like, everything's fine.
Yeah.
Let's have the funeral. Let's move on.
I mean, I would like to say there was closure, but the days and weeks that transpired after that would suggest that I didn't have closure.
Right.
Because grief started to come knocking pretty quickly after. But at the time of my father's death, it was, all right, here we are. It
was kind of surreal.
It was surreal, but it was also, there's a bit of relief,
Right.
That, that we use that sort of, that expression of like, they're at peace now. They're no longer suffering, right? People say that for a reason, because dying is not like, it's not the most comfortable experience. He was obviously in pain. He was obviously scared, despite what he said.
Right.
So for a couple days, it was like...
Well, but the scared and the pain thing are separate, right? Like, he was in pain, but he wasn't scared.
Yeah,
you're right. Like, he
didn't seem like he was scared of dying.
Right.
What he did say is he felt like he had lived his life. And I think this is interesting. He felt like he was no longer contributing to life. So if he felt like that, to some degree, that justified his own death. He wasn't fighting for life, not because he felt like he hadn't lived a life.
Or he had some new tasks to do.
Yeah.
Right.
That it was like he had done his deal, and now he wasn't working. His children were grown. For us, it was like, Dad, you do so much. We just love to have you around.
Right.
But from his subjective experience, he was, it's like that idea that we seem like we just want comfort, but we're really beasts of burden, right? And that's where we derive our meaning.
We want purpose.
We want purpose. We want responsibility. And his life had become devoid of that for health reasons and circumstantial reasons. And so he's just...
So almost it would be like his purpose changed to die.
Yeah.
Right? That's his purpose.
Yeah.
To go out as gracefully as you can go.
Yeah.
Right?
And then but the other thing that I could tell, even though he said he wasn't afraid of dying, he did say that when he was getting sicker, he had a lot of time to think. And what he'd say is that the unfortunate thing is you would hope that you would think about the good times. But what he spent a lot of time thinking about was the regrets in his life.
The stuff you missed, or the way you treated somebody, or
what I should have done different,
Wow.
And that's another thing, I think, where it's very I think just to be able to cope with things, it's easier to adopt a belief of I have no regrets, I'm so glad things unfolded the way they did.
Right.
But the idea that of really looking at regrets in life, and looking them right in the eye is, I think, something different.
Yeah.
And so he mentioned that a bit, that he really spent a lot of time thinking about things that he wished he had done better.
Was there anything specific that, no, just he kept that to himself?
Yeah. He didn't tell me. And I interviewed him when he was in the hospital for periods of time, a couple weeks.
Did you record it?
I recorded.
Wow.
And I haven't even had the wherewithal to listen. I have hours of recordings. My father said for years, he said, if I wrote a book about my life, I would chapter it by the women that I was with.
He was a character. Yeah. How long was he with your mom?
25.
Oh, wow.
Years.
When she passed away, were they together?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Was that the love of his life?
Yes.
Wow.
But, and I never really learned until I did this that I assume my father was a big playboy, but he wasn't really, He had a
soft side.
Yeah,
a romantic side, maybe.
He had a number of significant lovers, but it would have been a book of, it wouldn't have been a 30-chapter book, it would have been an 8-chapter book.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. That's the way I framed our interviews. Is I said, all right, let's start from the beginning. Tell me about your first kiss.
Wow.
And we just walked through it all.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's probably some interesting material, though.
Yeah.
You think if you listen to it, you got to wait?
Yeah.
A little more distance.
Maybe. I used some of it when my father, since he died during the pandemic, we couldn't do a service for him. but then we eventually got together and did a virtual service for him. And for that, we put together some stuff. And I did go back and I found a clip of him talking, and I played it.
At the virtual
thing.
How'd that go over?
Good.
Yeah. Well, because knowing you so personally now, over the last couple of years, you have a philosophical mind. Does the apple fall far from the tree in that? Because your dad's, he seems like he's a deep thinker. Mm-hmm. He's an artist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, to some degree. I think, again, I was sort of cut from a cloth that was a combination of him and his brother. My dad was more of just kind of like a lover, and he was a guy who was really he was really committed to saying yes to things. And that was a great role model for him. It was like, I'll just show up. And he would living in downtown LA, he was friends with way cooler people than I was, like just in the art scene, and people wanted to have him around. He'd show up to these things, and he spent a couple years of his life just hanging out with homeless people.
Wow.
Taking thousands of pictures of homeless people and going into encampments, and he really got close with one particular homeless guy named Harry, who he spent over a year with, and he was the last person there at the hospital when he died from an infection that he got from intravenous drug use, and found out that Harry was never even my dad's, Harry was never even his real name. And, so he's had this whole phase of his life where he was just very fascinating, and this is as a 50, 60, he would have been in his 60s at this point, your old man that became, really studying photography, learning about cameras and, editing film and printing film, and it wouldn't have been film, it was digital, but and walking around and talking to homeless people. And so he was very curious in that way. But if we were to try to get down and really, talk, he would probably... Not avoid, but I think that was, he would probably kind of go, this is, you're too smart for me. Like,
oh, okay. Yeah.
He wouldn't want to...
What about your mom, though?
My mom... I don't know. I don't know how I would classify my mom.
Because, you like to talk shop. So do I, right? That's why we're doing this. That's why we have cameras and all this stuff. I'm just wondering where it comes from.
Yeah.
Because it is fun. There's something about it that we like, right? With the Logosphere and two mind meeting and talking. Mm-hmm. There is an artistic route in that, right? Mm-hmm. But... so your dad was a gentle giant, basically. He was an artist. He was a gentle giant. He was fun, right? He was loving. So you said the grief starts coming in later, though. Or was it days after?
Days after. A couple days of reprieve. And then we were leaving for a walk. Claire and I would go on these walks around downtown. The streets were empty because we were still solid in the whole lockdown.
It was lockdown time. Yeah.
And we just went out, and I remember seeing his keys, by the front door, hanging there. Dad's gone, the hospital bed's been taken out, and then we're walking out, and there's his keys hanging there. And then I remember I turned around, and my father, he was an eccentric person in his own way, and he was hyper organized. And so by his computer, he had all of these bins, and they were all labeled for what they contained. It was DMV or health insurance or Chris's student loans or whatever.
Right.
And they were all his handwriting. And I looked over and I saw that thing that for me was very reflective of the kind of person he was.
Right.
And then I just felt very sad. And then it just was on and cracking.
Wow. Now, you had been sober for a state of time. When did you start?
I lost my sobriety probably prior to him getting sick. It would be easy enough for me to say that it was that it was the tragedy that really...
So the story gets interesting.
It does.
Wow. So the resting on the laurels got you.
The resting on the laurels, and then the openness to psychedelic substances. As I started to think hey, not all drugs are created equal. Okay. I'm not going to do this, that, or the other, but
But what caused that? Why?
Honestly, probably a lot of the listening to people like this talk.
Really? About, yeah.
You know, because it's become pretty in vogue. You know, psychedelic use has become like more accepted and sort of trendy. And don't you know, all the people in Silicon Valley are microdosing, and you know, let's look back to the stoned ape hypothesis, and we wouldn't be humans if it wasn't for our relationship with, you know, psychedelic substances that goes back thousands of years. And this is, you know, this isn't the opiate epidemic. This is, you know, this isn't something you get addicted to. Like, you do it one day and it's a trial.
It's a revolution. Yeah, too. Like And
I think that a lot of that is true.
Yeah.
I still think it's true.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that it's still such that if you're in a recovery community, that the overwhelming majority of people don't agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with
that. And
I
don't think that they're wrong in that. And so what happens is, if you want to start experimenting in that way, you have to become less open in a environment where it is paramount above all else that you are as open as you can.
Completely open.
Yeah.
You can't lie. You can't cheat, steal, all that
stuff. So now you're
yeah.
showing up and you have a secret.
Yeah. You're showing up with a different, like, you're holding something back. Yeah. And okay, so that started.
Yeah.
But before you moved in with your pops.
Yeah.
And then.
But at that point, I was still like
going in, meeting up with people and doing commitments and stuff. Yeah.
Technically involved, and I still considered myself to be sober.
Right.
And
what was the first thing you started using?
I probably would have been mushrooms.
Oh, really? So you actually took that hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
You were listening to
I just
Joe
decided
Rogan
like
and
I don't know
Harris.
what I was thinking, bro.
And you're like, okay, well, I'll just go straight to the source.
The thing is that I scored from a guy the sober living program that I worked at. It was in Santa Monica, and there was an alley, and the guy who lived in the apartment behind us is the guy that I copped from. I was just out there one day, and I found this dude that was like this total surfer guy, and he was walking his dog, and it was an old dog, and I think the dog's name was Blue, and he was so cool, man. He was talking about Blue, and it's almost related to my dad. He had such a great attitude of like, Blue's led a great life, man. I hope she's got a couple days in her. I'm just going to be here by her side, and I'm going to walk her to the pearly gates. Mm-hmm. And he just started talking to me about all this kind of far out stuff. And as I was becoming more curious about like maybe reopening this, this chapter of my life and conceptualizing it a bit differently as it related to my own sobriety project, I thought, like, this guy's got to know,
Dang.
So I just saw him back there one day, and I said, what's up,
Let me get those magic mushrooms.
He said, come through.
How much did you take?
I don't remember. Not much.
Not much? Was it radical, though? Because you'd been sober for 9 years, 10 years, or 8 years or something?
I don't even remember the first time I did it, really. And I think it was cool.
But did you get re-addicted? Because I've had this experience. They say you can't get addicted to hallucinogenics like that, but I beg to differ. Because if you have the wrong mind, maybe, or the right mind for it, like, you can take it.
I think
for
I did.
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
I wasn't taking it very frequently, but there was but then I was like, oh, let's see,
let's keep going deeper.
Let's like, can you get this? Can you get that? LSD and MDMA. Those were like the first, three that I was like, let's run it. Let's run it with these things.
Now, did you stop going and meeting up with other sober people, or did you?
No.
So you were really like kind of lying.
Yeah, there was a couple people that I wasn't lying to,
Oh, really?
Within like that whole circle.
And did they co-sign your bullshit?
I was kind of like striped up enough that it was like, no, whatever, like no one, I was very.
But you weren't selling a story.
No, I was just like, this is where I'm at. This is what I'm doing.
Okay.
And I don't know. I didn't get a lot of pushback, but it wasn't a lot of people I told, for the most part. I didn't. I kept it very separate. But.
Did you feel like a fraud, though?
I did. I felt like a fraud.
Okay.
But there's, it's become, even in like very kind of by the book recovery circles, there's people like that are, ayahuasca's become a big trendy one.
Right.
There's people that are many years sober that are,
that go
to these.
But they're doing it like one time, right? Or two.
Yeah, or whatever. They do it periodically, but they do it, with a practitioner in a certain setting, but. So it's, and then there's the whole thing like, so there.
Do you think it would have been different if you would have done that way? Like if you would have gone, okay, I'm going to go to this retreat, and go puke in a bucket for a couple of days with a shaman, and go find the ayahuasca. What is it? The goddess, or something that everybody sees, or whatever, right? Like
maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that who knows how that would have all unfolded.
Right.
But then it was what that did is it opened that door. As much as I wanted to play mental gymnastics of saying it's this, that, or the other,
right,
I knew that I had already
crossed the invisible line.
I cracked open a door that I had previously had welded shut.
Right.
And I thought I can just let's leave it cracked open. It's fine.
Yeah, it's okay.
And it's fine if it stays cracked open, but once it's cracked, it's more likely to be pushed ajar and then eventually, flung wide open.
Right, in a flood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, so I started to, probably the earliest kind of addict behaviors, I started to collect, then I was like, I wasn't doing a lot, but I had, I wanted to get this and that. I sort of had my own little, like, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, kind of.
So me and you are a lot alike, because when we go down this drug rabbit hole, it's like, well, I need the mescaline, I need this, I need that, and it's like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was one of my favorite movies, right? And the book is really good too. I haven't read the whole thing, but I mean, getting a briefcase, filling it with all different types of uppers, downers, sidewinder, all that stuff, and then pouring alcohol on top of that, and it's just, I don't know.
And see, I left out all the substances that for me were not consciousness elevating.
Okay.
But what I did do is that my father, as he was starting to get sick, he was starting to have panic attacks. And so one of the earliest things he was prescribed was Xanax.
Okay.
That he would take as needed for these extreme panic, as he started to probably have to confront the fact of his imminent death, he started to have these horrible panic episodes.
Wow.
And so he got Xanax, and what I did is I took some from him, and I just put them in my Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas kit. Yeah. Just in case,
Right.
In case I had a bad trip.
Need a couple of blue footballs.
They'd be in there just for emergencies.
And that is addict behavior. Yeah. Like straight textbook.
Didn't touch them, but there they were.
Well, yeah. Did he have any other medications like
no.
Vicodin or anything heavier?
Not at this time. Just that. Just like the little footballs like you said.
Barbiturates, yeah.
They weren't barbiturates, they're benzodiazepines.
Sorry. Yeah. So, wow.
But then it was after he was really starting to get sick, and there was a few days when I hadn't slept, and I took one of those, not as not to save myself from a bad trip, but just because I needed to take the edge off. And then he was having such a hard time getting through the night, and it seemed like he was in a lot of pain, and so I talked to his doctor. And this is at this point now the addict's starting to come out.
He's woken
and it's
up.
saying like, doctor, you have to help my dad.
Wow.
Listen.
So you went down that route.
Yeah. And so he wrote him some Norcos, and I got him filled, and remember bringing him back from the pharmacy, and I brought him up, and my girlfriend was out. She was gone from the loft, and just as I was there, I heard the door. It was a big, heavy double door, and I heard the key, and she was starting to come in, and reflexively I, rip open the CVS bag, I pour a few in my hand, and I can't remember if I put them in my pocket or if I just sucked them down,
Wow.
But it wasn't. Yeah, it was enough.
So he was alive, and that self-talking mind addict was. All right.
At that point, then it was, so at what point I really lost my sobriety, I don't remember the day exactly. And different people might classify it at different points, but at that point, I had recrossed the invisible line.
Mm. Yeah, because it's interesting. It seems like the beginning of it was this curiosity. Mm-hmm. And maybe it was a true kind of pursuit into the spiritual realm. Because I'm in the same boat as you with ayahuasca and stuff. I mean, if somebody has severe trauma or they need to get over something or walk through something, I've seen a lot of people with good results from going on these trips and really facing a demon or whatever, a past trauma, and then coming back, and they never have to use that substance again. They're kind of through it, or through a version of it, right?
Yeah.
So there is positive to that. I mean, these drugs have been around for a long time. Yeah.
If we want to go down this road or not, but what happened to me is really being immersed in the recovery community.
Mm-hmm. No, let's go there.
Yeah. I started to feel stifled.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can make an argument that it's can be dogmatic and doctrinaire.
Mm-hmm.
And I became very sensitive to that. And someone who, at least nominally, was interested in some sort of pursuit of truth, I found myself very distracted by what appeared to me to be untruths. I started to use I don't know, the expression was like a useful myth, and the analogy what it cite is like a porcupine. So you know this idea that porcupines throw their quills. Mm-hmm. So porcupines don't actually throw their quills.
They just like whip them at you, right?
They don't even whip them at them. It's just that they're so thin that the ends of them aren't obvious. So
right. It's the coloring too, right?
They can they are longer than than you perceive them to be.
Okay.
So it appears like they throw their quills,
right?
But they don't. But if you believe they do, you're less likely to get stung
by a porcupine.
Right.
Right.
So it's a useful fiction.
Right.
You know.
So you're walking through
recovery, and I'm starting to see a lot of useful fictions. There's a lot of boys whistling in the dark to keep their spirits up, but it's like spiritual bypassing, right?
Okay.
You're saying all of these things.
Yeah.
In order so you can just keep life, you know, in this place where it's okay.
And that's a dangerous place to go, though, right? Because that you could say that about God, right? Like if you're a true existentialist, right? You can go like, okay, well, if we're just particles of dust bouncing, you know, it's like it's meaningless, right? There is no God, right? Would I choose to just be kind of this reckless, kind of meaningless void bouncing around, or should I just take a useful myth and believe in God? Because it's going to bring order to my life, and maybe I'll have a smile on my face more, right? I'll have a useful purpose instead of just being this meaningless Nietzschean void running around, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
And so that was what I was contending with.
So you're wrestling with God.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to. Yeah. Your belief.
And should I just adopt the framework that's useful, even though in my heart I feel like it's bullshit? And I couldn't. And should I have? Maybe. But I think that I needed to find out for myself.
And what did you find out?
That's what... Yeah. There's something Carl Jung wrote, and I'm going to paraphrase, of course, but it's something like, whatever you believe, whatever you choose to believe, at the end of the day, it's going to be arbitrary. There's no real way to fact test, fact check what your core beliefs are about the world, whether there is a God or there isn't a God, or it's this one or it's that one, you know. So it's going to be arbitrary in the sense that it's just like, it's unprovable and it could be any of them. So why don't you pick a belief that bears good fruits?
That's advantageous.
Yeah,
it's very Nietzschean.
It's a consequentialist approach, right? It's like, I don't know if there is a God or there, you know, isn't a God, but what happens for you when you think there is a God, and what happens for you when you don't? Right.
That reminds me of Nietzsche's internal recurrence theory, where like you make your decisions based on if you lived this decision 1,000 times. Yeah. Would you make that same decision, right? And that's how you're supposed to operate in the world metaphysically, right? And yeah. And so... But what did you learn from that? I mean, fuck all the fancy quotes and this guy and that guy. Like, what, like, would you go and do an ayahuasca retreat right now?
No.
Why not? What's the reason not to?
And this is probably not a very good reason, but on one level I could say because I'm afraid of what would happen if I do.
But what are you afraid of?
I think that one thing that I've always felt, for better or for worse, is a real fragility about life.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Is that sometimes it feels like it's just threads that are holding this whole thing together. And an experience like that, you know, I like things to be together. You know, I want a life that makes sense. And that doesn't mean that I'm not risk taking, and that doesn't mean that I've obviously had to have my own experience, and I've disregarded good advice, but I've road tested a lot, and I've run that simulation, you know. And I don't know if I could explain to you in a perfect A to B fashion what would happen. And I could be wrong by my hunches about it. But my sense is that it would not be better than not doing it. I don't know if that was a double negative in there, but
yeah, but I get where you're getting at. Like you basically, your response is that you've tested it. Like you've taken the magic mushrooms, you've done you've done all that stuff. You've done the fear and loathing trip, and you know where that road leads, right?
There's also
there's kind of like, you know, it's going to go.
There's a funny way with substances. This is a thing that I do, is I can't. A rational mind is such a beautiful tool, but it can be wielded for bad purposes. And so here's, you know, how come I can do nicotine and still be sober, but I can't do psilocybin and still be sober?
Right.
When nicotine it's a mood alterer. It's a mood alterer. It's highly addictive. In many forms, it's highly deadly. When psilocybin is not addictive in the same way, when it actually, research has proven that it has the potential to disrupt other harmful addictions, how come I can do one and still be sober and not the other? It's hard to make a good case for that.
Well, no, I ran into that. Remember those red lines back in the day? That was a big controversy in the recovery community.
I know.
And the whole stoop of it, what I came to was those red line bottles, and they were just energy drinks. Anybody could get them. You had to be 18, I think. So that was kind of weird, because the other energy drinks, you didn't have to be 18. But because of the caffeine content in one bottle, you had to, or something. It was something like that, right? And so there was a huge controversy for many years on that. And people would say, if you drink a red line, you're basically, you're not sober anymore, right? And that was, to me, it was so weird. And then I remember reading the label and saying, oh, there's 2 doses in here. So if I drink half a red line, then it's like having a Red Bull, right? So I'm still sober, right? If I drink, but I don't believe in that anyways, right? I think you can drink a whole red line. I've drank a whole red line in sobriety, and I don't think I'm not,
But
sober.
you probably thought about it, right?
Yeah, I thought about it. Yeah, of course. And I mean, but that's the side of the fence I'm on, but that was an interesting, weird kind of bump in the road.
I think there's something to be said about, on one hand, it's important to think through things yourself.
Right.
But then sometimes it's nice to outsource those decisions. The community might know better than you do.
Exactly.
Even if no one can perfectly articulate why smoking a cigarette, you're still sober, eating a mushroom, you're not.
Yeah.
We could have that debate all day long.
Right.
And you might be able to come out on top with a argument that goes contrary to what the greater community would feel.
Right.
But the greater community might be smarter than your rational mind.
Right.
Than
your one
mind.
Because
it's the collection. It's this sort of amorphous. It's the shared cognition, right?
Yeah.
It's the hypermind.
Right.
And it might know some things that you don't.
Right. Because it's been around a lot longer.
Yeah.
And it's seen a lot of people die.
Yeah.
And be
so,
born.
I think that's one thing that I've learned is it's like culture, right? That same thing that felt stifling and rigid to me, I developed a new appreciation for what that has to offer.
The discipline, the structure, the piety.
Certainly watching my dad die, it certainly puts into focus the fact that life is finite.
Right.
And
it really puts it in. Yeah, you see it viscerally.
It's in 4K,
5K, 6K,
whatever we're at now.
I mean, but that story, that I mean, just wrapping your dad up thing. I mean, that is like, I mean, I'm kind of back on my seat on that whole thing because I'm sad I didn't make you cry. Yeah. But you got close though.
Yeah.
You were getting the threads were coming out.
There still might be time.
There still might be some time. We might get there, but
I think that it. So then I realized, okay, what do I want to do with my life that's remaining? That's, I think, one thing that even like with my grandmother and my dad and the year we've been a real prince, it's like when you're staring death in the face, in one way or another, it makes you think about your priorities in life. It's like you sort of have to do a valuation of your whole personal business. And
so what pulled you out? So you go on this thing, you start telling the doctor that your dad needs medication. You start you hand pocketed some, or you take some. Do you keep taking his medication?
Yeah.
And getting it more prescribed. And he's probably not even really using it anyways, right? Because
he's using whatever I give him. And he's got plenty. And
so it's not, you don't feel like you're like stealing stuff from him.
I never felt like he was going without
what he needed.
No.
Right. So there's none of that. I don't have that guilt thing.
I don't actually have. I've never thought about that really. You could probably make a good case for that. Like, how dare you take away
and that case gets made a lot because these stories come up in our community, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is just like that. It's like, this is the person's last little bit, and you showed up at, whatever.
You took all the pills, or you piece of shit. You know, yeah, of course.
But for him, he eventually got put on hospice, and then when you're on hospice, you just they're like, what do you need?
Yeah, they just give you injections too, right? Yeah, like,
it's not injection. They do orally.
Oh, orally.
It's oral
liquid.
Yeah, usually it's liquid morphine. Yeah. But he got liquid dilaudid, and liquid.
Did you creep on any of that stuff, or you? Yeah. Oh, you did.
Yeah.
So you really.
And then I went full. All out. I would.
Now, this is going to be an interesting paradox. So you're actively using, and the addict's getting bigger and stronger as your dad's dying. Do you think that helped you get through it?
That's a good question.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, do you think it numbed you maybe to the pain?
Yeah.
Like you were still in pain, you were still in existential angst about your dad dying, but it just kind of puts a blanket over the situation, numbs you just a little bit enough.
See, there's so many people that are able to, my dad was really, he was 76 when he died.
Okay.
Which is a life.
That's a long life, yeah.
He didn't die prematurely by any sort of reasonable measure. It wasn't like, I didn't lose a child. This is a normal course of life.
Right. Right.
But I had a very personal experience with it.
Right.
And he was my last parent.
Right.
And I was still relatively young for most people.
Of course.
Yeah.
And the way you went out too, it's not,
But there's people that walk through and stay sober through stuff that is much more tragic, much more untimely.
Right.
Than what I was unable to.
Right.
I remember I watched an episode of Intervention, I think it was.
Yeah.
And this particular episode, it was a young woman, and I can't remember how many members of her family. I think like both her kids died in a fire, in their apartment caught on fire, and she lost two little girls, and then her marriage fell apart, and she went off the rails, and so they're intervening on her, and they pull in the big guns. They pull in this interventionist who really specializes in trauma of this magnitude. And what I think the interventionist says to the family is, listen, there's certain experiences in life that only allow people two options. One is suicide, and the other one is substance abuse. And I think in this circumstance, your daughter picked the better option.
Wow. Now, that applies to you then?
It does.
Right, because obviously, I mean, we've talked personally about this, but you were very suicidal at this point. So you're actively using drugs again, right? Daily?
daily. Eventually. It's a
right.
whole. We don't have time to probably get into the whole landscape of the use and attempts to not use.
But I think we pinned down when you felt like you lost your sobriety. Like maybe the magic mushrooms you were going to try to do like an ayahuasca kind of healing trip, and then you went, oh, I'm going to go again, and then I'm going to go again, and then it's like, okay, I crossed the line, right? Well, who cares when that is? But it happened, right? And so you're daily using. What are you using?
Eventually the hospice. He dies. I hoard as much hospice stuff as I can. I run out.
Oh, so you jacked the hospice guys, or?
Yeah, I mean, it was just whatever was left. They have to come collect it, and I'm like, here it is. Here's the rest, and then I put it all in a bottle somewhere. But I was using still a lot of. For a while, I was using a lot of ketamine.
Okay.
Ketamine.
Is that considered a psychedelic?
It is considered a dissociative. So it's.
I mean, I did ketamine before a long time ago, and I remember, like, the K-hole thing. I kind of experienced something similar to that. I wouldn't...
Yeah, so I had probably had a similar experience to you with the substance prior to this.
Okay, yeah.
Done it a couple times, was at a
For
party,
shits
did it
and
once
giggles.
at home, kind of had a K-hole, it was sort of weird.
Yeah, you're, like, on the couch, like, whoa, yeah.
But this time I had a real, like, I took that thing to every corner that I could.
Wow.
And so it was the main things were Xanax and ketamine.
And you were taking that daily?
Daily.
Wow.
Ketamine maybe not every day, but a lot of the days. Xanax every day. That was the thing that really had me by the tail, is that I wanted to try to put all this behind me, but once I crossed the line with the benzodiazepine physical addiction, I couldn't self detox. I would get a couple days.
It's a nasty one. Yeah.
So that was horrible, but the ketamine was one that I was taking that while he was still alive quite a bit. So that was part of the whole, like, mushrooms and LSD and MDMA, and then ketamine was all through the same kind of community.
Oh, okay.
Burning Man. You can go to these places.
Of course.
They call it hippie heroin. It's and ketamine is one that if you suffer from severe depression, there's hundreds of clinics in Los Angeles that are eager to give you ketamine.
Wow.
And there's lots of research to support what an effective treatment it can be for like therapeutically resistant depression.
So that's just that's your mind going, oh yeah, well look, the scientists and this and that,
yeah, it's a miracle drug.
It's a miracle drug,
and some people claim that it is, and they could be right. But I was, for me, it almost felt like I was dying with my dad, starting to develop a relationship with that substance. It's a real, like, K-hole experience is like a death. It's what I could only assume death might be something like, and not like really actively dying.
Wow.
And I was just.
Were you trying to die?
I don't know. Not with that. It was just, then it was piecemeal. It started to add up until the SI, the suicidal ideation, started to creep in.
When did that come in?
I don't know. It was probably after he passed.
Okay.
But
maybe before. Who knows? Yeah. Right.
And then it just, at some point, it became all pervasive. It was just every day
thinking about it, and not ever really like a plan, but not. It was more serious than. I'm just thinking about planned.
it.
Yeah. Like you could have done it. Like if the wrong thing had happened.
A super high risk.
Right.
Super high risk.
You were walking on a tightrope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at that point, it was really like, I was definitely I was self-medicating because it was the only thing at my disposal to make that mode of thinking subside.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So it was just vacillating back and forth.
It was like a Band-Aid.
That looming, unbearable feeling, and then I would soothe it.
Where do you think that comes from? That's an interesting. I mean, we could probably spend a whole other episode on it. I mean, we're already going kind of far, but whatever.
Yeah.
Why do people want to commit suicide?
Yeah.
Where does that come from? I mean, I know trauma and it like leads to it or whatever, but because I've had similar experiences as far as that suicidal ideation, and I've actually had plans. I've had guns in my mouth. I was about to do it. All that stuff. I've tried several times to kill myself, but I've just always am curious. Like, where does that come from? Is there like an evil demon inside, somebody's brain? And if you just feed that wrong wolf, right, too much, you're just pop, and it's like, okay, it's time to kill myself.
It's one of those things too, where you could ask the question, what would drive someone to do that?
Yeah.
But then also, like, what would prevent someone from doing that?
Yeah, well, and that's Camus' big thing. Like in the majority of his writing, one of his first questions is it justified to commit suicide?
Yeah, it's like that's serious question.
That's his philosophy. I mean, he wrote a whole book about it. So it's just it's like, but not everybody has that though. Do you feel that like I feel like it's a certain type, or is it genetics? Is it circumstances? Yeah.
For me, I'm more.
Well, maybe we'll explore that another time. But it's a fascinating question.
I'm certainly more maybe prone to negative emotion, maybe. But it was certainly circumstantial that it got to the point that it did.
It's probably a bit of both, and intellect too. I feel like sometimes when you hear these crazy suicides that happen, it's like, man, he was the smartest dude, or the smartest girl. Like, what the fuck? Like, how, and circumstance.
Yeah,
you just blame that, and it's like, well, are you sure?
And the overthinking can be a problem. It comes back to just wanting to adopt a framework that works, it's just...
And not being able to get that framework. And so it's like, okay, it doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, so the suicidal ideation's going on. Maybe we'll get through this. How did you get pulled out of it? Like, what happened? Like, how does it stop? How are you sitting here now?
I think I was trying to get out of it the whole time. You were? I don't think I was ever committed to it.
So were you scared of it? Because how you hear those things like, I wanted to kill myself, but I'm too much of a chicken shit to do it. Have you heard that? You hear that sometimes from people.
I never really, I had a pervasive thought of how I would do it, and I did, like, I remember reading that Dr. Kevorkian wrote a book that was like, it was sort of tips on how to do it, and I never got even as far as buying the book because it's not easy to find, but I remember
hearing about that book. I
remember research, trying to find it. I remember feeling interested in learning more about how to practically do that.
What about that philosopher in Africa,
the anti-natalist?
Yeah. I mean, were you researching that kind of crap?
No, I was already kind of hip to that, and I still think it's an interesting, for those of you who aren't familiar, the way that I describe the anti-natalist breakdown is, and as it relates to suicide, so anti-natalism is the idea that life is just asymmetrically bad, and that it doesn't justify its own existence. But the anti-natalist doesn't believe, so if you believe that, why don't you kill yourself?
Right, that's cool.
The analogy that I heard was, it's like going to a bad show. If you get dressed and you pack up the car and you drive across town and you get to a play, and halfway through the first act you realize this isn't a very good play, you've already made it to the play. And so,
do you kill yourself now?
You finish the play,
at least.
But if you knew it was a bad play, you wouldn't suggest your friends go. You wouldn't go back.
So you wouldn't have kids.
You wouldn't have kids. Yeah.
You wouldn't propel this horrible existence, this play of hell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you also wouldn't end it. You're already there. You already got to the show.
So that's where you're at.
That's not where I'm at. I don't, but I think that's...
But you were kind of tiptoeing on that, maybe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or you were beyond that if you're suicidal. Yeah, of course, yeah. The play's over.
Yeah, and I thought you meant presently.
Presently. Well, no, I did mean presently.
Yeah.
But that was a little... I know you're not that, but yeah. Okay, so let's get back. So what pulls you out of it, though? So you feel like there's a part of you...
It's really fighting for trying to get back.
Just trying. It's that maybe that God-centeredness, that still small voice is screaming out at the top of its lungs, but it comes out in this like tiny voice, and it's not.
And I'm
it's
reaching
hard.
out. That same hospice guy, I reach out to him. I don't know why I can't think of his name. And I even sign up for like a grief class that he does.
Okay.
And I never go to any of it. I spend $50 and sign up for this thing that's going to be like online and with some other people.
Now, did you feel like you ostracized yourself because you were part of a community that is really, really equipped to dealing with this kind of shit?
I was not.
And now you're not a part of that community anymore.
And so I started to reach out to that community.
You did? Okay.
Yeah. And
was that the beginning of the end for the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Started to pray.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
When did you start praying again?
I don't know how long before I eventually got sober, but shortly before.
And you just said, what was it like? God, please help me.
That's it.
Just simple.
That's it. That's what it always is, right? It's the best prayer.
It is the best prayer.
Said from the heart. It's just like kryptonite, right?
And you actually mean it, too.
It's like, that what do you call it? That foxhole prayer.
Right.
You know, you kind of, we joke about it, but that's a real prayer.
That's a real prayer. That's a real prayer. And so you start saying the prayer, but I remember you talked about something with Jordan Peterson, like you were...
Yeah, I saw Jordan Peterson, because, Jordan Peterson had his own,
YouTube thing, right?
Well, he had fallen off the face of the earth.
Oh, that's right, because of his sickness.
Yeah,
okay.
He got all hooked on benzos for different reasons, I'm sure, than I did, but... he went through all this stuff he went through, and he was, in his own way, by his own admission, kind of hanging by a thread in his own life. And he had, it really kind of paralleled my own experience, probably time-wise. And then he started to crawl back. And the first time I saw him, I was in the middle of a very deep depression. And he showed up on his daughter's podcast with Wim Hof, the Iceman, the sort of... cold exposure breathwork guru,
right?
From Denmark, maybe. Might be getting
I think you're right. Yeah, a Northman.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah,
and so he has a very simple breathing exercise that he does, and he had Jordan do it live on the podcast, and I had the wherewithal to join them, and that was another thing that just.
Do you think that was a turning point?
I do.
Really? So you do this exercise, and it's through YouTube, ironically, right? And
I get a little relief.
You get just a tiny relief.
It's over, and I go.
Did the fox hair prayer happen before that?
I don't know.
You don't know.
Yeah.
Because you were in like a.
I was
You're all over the place.
Fighting and then giving up.
Yeah.
Fighting and then giving up.
Wow.
And so that I just noticed right afterwards, it's like, oh, that will. To fight or to live or to show up or to, that they say my life had become somewhat important to me again,
Just a little threat.
Bit, a little important.
Like a life preserver got thrown into the water.
And I kind of go, interesting, and then I do it again.
Oh, okay.
And then I get in the shower, cold shower, I do it the next day. I start going for walks. I'm not
Get
sober,
out of the house. Yeah.
Go for a walk, eat something healthy, and then, flip out, and then have 3 days of, that ends in tears and, and a broken mirror in my room and, and then...
Bloody fists.
Yeah, and then back,
Do the breathing technique.
Yeah.
Maybe get out and take a walk, eat something healthier.
Yeah.
And then repeat. Bam.
Yep.
How long did that go on?
A couple months, probably. I was trying to detox myself off of Xanax and taking less and less and titrating myself. And I was able to get several days. And I was taking GHB as well, a lot of GHB.
Why do I know that? What is that?
GHB, I don't know how it's classified, but it's taken as a liquid. It's a famous kind of date rape drug. And it's also well known in like party scenes. It kind of gives an effect similar to alcohol. But there's a very tight window on it. So if you do a little GHB, there's no effect, and then there's like a light giddiness, and then a little bit more, and eventually it's like sleep paralysis, like unconscious to the point where you can't be woken up, and then it can become deadly. So there's a very tight. So people who use it will use timers and they use droppers, and you have to incrementally use it and monitor how much you use because you're trying to catch the sweet spot. But I was using some of that to try to to substitute the benzos that I was trying desperately to get myself off of. And it was just days and nights, sleeplessness, extreme anxiety, and I just couldn't cope. And so eventually I just, sought help, and I was medically detoxed.
Yeah. So what did you do? Do you call somebody? Was it your girlfriend?
I called someone. I eventually bit the bullet in March.
You bit the better bullet, though.
The better bullet, yeah. I bit the better bullet. But at the very end of the year, I called a treatment program, and I knew that I needed help at that point. And
this is what, a little, like almost 2 years ago now, a year and a half.
This is
ago.
December of 2020. Is that right?
Yeah.
Are we in 2022 now?
We're in 2022. Yeah.
December of 2020, but then it was like Christmas is coming up, and then New Year's, and my girlfriend and I were living with my sister, and my girlfriend had left her place. She had just been through all this. Now she's living with my sister, who she doesn't really know that well, and her kids, 40 miles from where she was before, and now her relatively new relationship is going to go off to treatment for 3 months or whatever. And she was freaked out, and so she was, this is going to sound like I'm throwing her under the bus. I'm really not, but I think part of her was, and she also maybe wasn't so privy to how severe it was.
Yeah, well, and she's
for me
grieving
internally,
as well.
Yeah.
She
just wanted, she's
Yeah.
like, we can do this.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, I think you're right. I think we can. Let's try.
Yeah.
And then eventually it became evident to her and me that
it's just
we couldn't. We're not worth trying.
Yeah. Well, but it sounds like it was a personal thing though, with you. It's not her. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So you go to treatment. You get a medical detox.
It's hell.
How long did you detox?
I guess 7 days.
Wow.
Of a taper. They taper off the benzo for, I don't know if it was 7 days or 14 days. Either it could have been 4 months and it would have been too short. It was just so. At some point it was just hell.
Now, at what point did your head pop out of your ass? Like when you got the pop. What I mean? Like you go from all this hell and suicidal ideation, drugs, and you go through the detox, and that's hell. We both know that from personal experience. And then you finally end up in a group where you're talking about your feelings, right?
Yeah.
Was there a time where you realized, like, oh man, I was all fucked up? Yeah. Was there a popping experience at all?
I don't know when the day was. I remember coming back and still being very upset about my circumstances and not being particularly eager to
jump in,
to be in recovery again. And then at some point that changed for me, and I don't know what to attribute it to.
It just did.
Yeah.
You just got kind of sucked up into the...
I do know that one thing that was helpful for me is actually Jordan Peterson.
Right.
That I was really early on. I was reading his most recent book.
Okay.
Right at the ground zero, in detoxing, shaking, and I had his book. I brought it with me, and I was reading it. And as I said, one of the things that made it so that I couldn't really get the full value from recovery is that it was a useful myth. It was too ideological. Right?
Right. And he's really against ideology.
Yeah.
That's
so you
thing.
think that reading him would only substantiate my claim that this was too ideological. Right. But the real takeaway that I got from it is, don't be so cynical about something that you haven't really done. If you're looking down on something, what might be the case is that you just don't have the wherewithal to step up to the plate. And if I really search my soul and ask myself, have I really done this? Have I really tried? Yeah. Or am I just criticizing it as a way to cop out from really having to step up to the plate and live a life in this way? And the answer that I got to was the latter. and his writing helped me with that.
That's so fascinating. I mean, because he's obviously been a power in both our lives, but through YouTube and then reading his book, and then you already being in the gauntlet of recovery and the community and everything like that. It's like this happy storm that kind of animated you back to life.
Yeah, there was an unhappy storm that broke me down, then a happy storm that reanimated me.
Right.
And that really is interesting how that lines up with sort of like some of his life work as it relates to chaos and order.
Right.
And just having the whole structure sort of
the floor fall from underneath you.
Yeah, and then to reconstitute it.
You've lived the words that are written. I mean, whether it's in the Bible or it's in his book, it doesn't matter. Or the Quran, you know what I mean? You've been there.
Yeah.
And you've walked through that. So
this is just one event, really. It's a drawn out event that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But you have to sort through so many of the particulars before you can even start to get to the marrow of the matter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right.
And there's so many threads in just this one situation that were left
completely not talked about. Yeah.
But then, all of that has to.
It, yeah.
And I'm not saying we'll get back to this, but
we'll get back to a thread of this. I'm sure of it. Yeah.
Well, you're next.
Yeah, I'm next on the hot seat. So I didn't feel like I was in a hot seat. I don't think you felt like you were in a hot seat. I wasn't. All right. Well,
you're gonna feel like it next week.
I don't know. We're so used to. The thing is we're so used to talking about our feelings, right? It's almost like we're trained psychiatrists without a degree, really, right? I mean, I don't know. Jesus.
We'll end it there.
But that might get cut. So, anyways,
thank you for joining us.
Thanks for listening all the way through, and like and subscribe, and we will be back with another one.
Cheers.
All right, cheers, bye.